Um, I want to thank Libby and all the people who have told their stories before. This weekly elder tree has been a real highlight during these long weeks that we have been sort of shut inside, and gives me courage. Problem? And also, maybe happened for everyone, started my reminiscences about my own life and my childhood. I was born in Boston, Massachusetts, a very long time ago, to very young parents. They had gone through the Depression. Their lives of childhood were very difficult. Went through the Depression right into World War II. My father served in the South Pacific. Excuse me. We lived in a series of small towns in Massachusetts, and they endeavored, and I would say succeeded, to give us the kind of stability and security that neither of them had known as kids. Mother was a Roman Catholic, my father was an Episcopalian, so the reasonable choice for our religious education was Unitarianism. And I was sent, I guess my brother must have been too, to a series of beautiful white wooden churches with tall steeples. Ultimately, we moved to Marshfield, Massachusetts, near Duxbury, Plymouth County, where my parents bought their dream house. It was a 270-year-old or so Cape Cod, a real one, sat at the end of a half-mile long driveway. No neighbors, very isolated. My father was a writer. He used his skills in writing direct mail advertising, which he hated. He was very good at it. Mother was his secretary and the bookkeeper. He had a friend who did artwork, another friend who was a printer. He always refused to expand his business because he never wanted to be responsible for another man's family, something I have thought about as so many people have had to let their beloved employees fire them because of COVID. We were very active. It was a small town, 5,500 people, small high school. So we were all in everything, very active, and were supported by our parents. I worked at the local drugstore on Saturdays and in the summer. Came time to think about college. My parents had not gone to college. My father expected that I would go take a secretarial course somewhere. That was the furthest thing from my imagination. Ultimately, it was decided that, all right, you can go to any college you get into, provided that it does not cost more than the price of in-state tuition at UMass Amherst. They had always told us that Marshfield, Massachusetts was the world, that there were so many more exciting places and things out there outside of our little town. So somebody had told me about the Women's College of the University of North Carolina, and that is where I wound up, in Greensboro, North Carolina. I knew absolutely nothing about North Carolina, the South. The sit-down strikes, the beginning of the civil rights movement, had begun in Greensboro in 1956. So I was well aware of that and had very strong opinions about what should be done. We drove to North Carolina. There were no interstates then. So I saw for the first time the level of poverty that some of my fellow citizens had to endure. And I arrived in Greensboro convinced that I should set things right. Fortunately, my parents got wind of this and said, you might want to listen first before you speak. Very good advice. I have never followed often enough. So I'm settled into the dorm and I meet my roommate. And she says to me, "Are you a Christian?" And I thought, I had no idea what to make of this. I had gone to the Unitarian Church all those years at a time, maybe some of you might not know, pre-Chalice, and when Jesus Christ was regularly mentioned during the services, as a leader, as a teacher, never as an aspect of God. So I explained all of this to my roommate as best I could, and she informed me that if that's what I thought, therefore I was not a Christian. That was okay with me. I had a good time at WC. I had a lot to learn. I didn't have proper manners for a good Southern lady. I didn't say, yes, sir, yes, ma'am. I spoke my mind. I wasn't as sweet and gentle as I should have been. But I did make friends and did get invited to people's houses where their mothers would tell me, oh, all this civil rights agitation. My maid says it's all the kids, it's the older people don't support it. And I imagine that the maid was in the kitchen rolling her eyes. On campus, the school was integrated. By that, I mean there were maybe 10 African-American women who were at one half of one floor in one of the dormitories. All of the little shops and restaurants near the campus were segregated. So we got it in our minds to picket, and we did march in front of these little restaurants, and ultimately were able to convince the owners that the restaurant should admit everyone. The movie theater guy said, well, I can't do that because you girls aren't here in the summertime, and what will I do? And that seemed reasonable to us. So we were able to go to a lot of meetings and to sing Kumbaya and We Shall Overcome. And I suppose today we would consider our activities would be considered performative, but we were very young, very idealistic, and very sincere in what we hoped to accomplish. But of course, others did so much more. I spent a summer at Chapel Hill, the University of North Carolina, and one day in the library, I met a guy. And that turned out to be the person I married, as you all know, Howard. He was ahead of me in school. He had to do his military service. So ultimately, we were married at the First Parish Unitarian Church in Duxbury, Massachusetts, hung around New York City for a period, and then wound up in Newport, Rhode Island. I know Glenn Cook was there too. Where Howard did his training to become an officer in the United States Navy. Our first child was born there also. Then we loaded the baby and all of her gear into a VW Bug, one of the real ones, 1961 model, and put her in a car bed and drove to San Diego. Took 10 days cross country. I remember our parents were very concerned about this. We weren't. So we were, because of Howard's trainings and the movements of the ship, we were in San Diego and Long Beach, San Francisco, back to Long Beach. Most of the time, Jessica and I were on our own because of Howard be out to sea. We were fortunate there was only one 6-month deployment cruise, I guess I should say. In any event, he came home one day and said, ship's going to Japan, do you want to go? So we were expecting our second child by this time, but the ship sailed off, leaving Jessica and me to get ourselves geared up for the big move. And off we went to Japan. The ship was at Yokosuka. It was a former Japanese naval base. And I lived with some friends nearby in a little fishing village called Hayama. We had access, of course, to everything on the base in terms of grocery store, medical care, and all of that. The Japanese house was wonderful. Tiny three-room house with tatami, and one whole side of the house was all glass sliding doors. Kitchen wasn't too exciting. There was a sink, and we got a couple of burners, and I had an electric stove, so we could have parties. I could cook for people. It was the Vietnam War was heating up at this time, but it's 1966, 67. Not too much going on in the United States in terms of opposition. Our second daughter was born in Hayama, and my friends took care of all of us, and Jessica took care of her and me. Jessica went to a Buddhist nursery school, so that was her first religious instruction. And I would drive her to that school. The road curved by the ocean, and the bay. And across the bay, if it was a clear day, I could see Mount Fuji. And it was one of the most wonderful, almost daily experiences of my life at that time. Our wonderful year was soon up, and we came what to do next. Howard was thinking he wanted to stay in the Navy, so he asked for an extension, and we wound up in Rochester, New York, which you may have probably aware has a shortage of oceans. But he was teaching in ROTC at the University of Rochester, and both of us were taking classes. Jessica started Witten Road Nursery School. We joined the church by this time in our mid-20s, and we became quite active at that time. Perhaps you've never heard of this. There was something on Wednesdays, free babysitting, Mother's Morning Out. So I would go to Mother's Morning Out and help the other women make things to sell at the church bazaar. We actually bought our very first house from the church. It had been the parsonage for David Reese Williams on Highland Parkway. It was a good, solid house, but I can assure you the church had not spent any money on paint or paper or anything else in all the years Reverend Williams lived there, which meant we could afford it. And so we began fixing up this house. I was active in church stuff and nursery school stuff, and beginning to think that, what am I going to do? One girl's in school, the other one's in nursery school. My time was coming. Mary Jones said last week, I had the quote and I can't find it, that she had forged her career in parallel with the opportunities that had come to her husband in his career. And that was true for me. Basically, my life and the things that I did came about as the result of the choices that my husband made. So I'm happy, I'm having a good time. And Howard comes home and says, we're going to Brazil. And Brazil at that time, maybe still does to some of you, seemed even further away than it does now. It's a very long way. It's a country bigger than the continent of the United States. We moved to Sao Paulo, which was at that time a city of 9 million people. It was a very different experience than going to Japan, not just because a different country, different everything, but because we were living more truly on the economy, sort of. If you make a corporate move, usually corporations will pay a lot of money so people are willing to make these kinds of moves with their families. And so people had servants and cars and maybe club memberships and things like that. And in that sense, maybe had more of those kinds of things than they would have had back at home. And that some of that was also true for us. It's a lot of fun. It's kind of an unreal life. But in any event, we settled in, and I thought, again, what am I going to do? Well, one thing I did was have another baby. So Stephen was born in Sao Paulo, and thus it came about that maybe my major claim to fame is that our 3 children were born through no planning on my part in 3 different countries on 3 different continents. But I had help in the house, kids were in school, and I had already been a lady who, when I was in the Navy, had already done the luncheon and the card playing kind of life, and it did not appeal to me. So Howard said, why don't you get a job? And there was a place called the Association Alumni, and that was in a beautiful old mansion. And it had been started by Brazilian alums of American universities. And the idea was to teach English to kids who wanted to go study in the United States. So I had no qualifications other than being a native speaker and having a degree in English. They gave me a job. And it was wonderful. I worked 4 days a week, 3 or 4 hours a day, and I could change the schedule to be in the morning or in the afternoon or in the evening. And so in that way, I met people of all different ages, businessmen, housewives, that's what they were called, and students. And it gave me an interesting perspective on life in the country. I have to say they were from a very upper class point of view, since the school was expensive. Brazil at that time was booming. The city had definitely outgrown its infrastructure. So sometimes if there was a terrible rainstorm, the streets would be flooded, or the electricity wouldn't work, or there would be a water shortage, and the water boxes would fill only at night. So since I was still wanting to do things American style, I'd be running the washing machine at 2 o'clock in the morning, because that's when I could have more water. But there had been a particularly brutal dictatorship. So our students would not talk about Brazilian politics. They were very fascinated by American politics, because part of the time was the Watergate and goings on, and they were astonished that we were all shocked that something like that was happening in our country. For our Brazilian friends and students, politics equaled corruption. And for us, it was, for most of us, I guess, a new idea, new experience. There are some echoes from that time that I've been thinking about as we go through the COVID. There was a big meningitis outbreak. And I remember standing in with the children, standing in a very, very long line, miles long, for everybody to have shots, a vaccine, an experimental vaccine brought in by the WHO against this meningitis. And actually 2 people that I know did get the meningitis. We always had shortages. It was a managed economy, price controls. So sometimes you would go to the grocery store and there's no toilet paper, there's no cooking oil, there's no this, there's no that, until the government would allow the manufacturers to raise the prices. Just like last March, well, sort of. They're also, we're trying to protect the nascent industries. So you would see cheese, for example, Brazilian cheese, typical Brazilian cheese, and then nothing could be imported. So you would see cheddar type cheese or something else type, and it'd be one, whatever there was, there was one kind. But there was everything that we needed and wonderful fruits and vegetables. It was a really, really happy time. I loved my work. I loved learning so very much from everyone that we met, the students, the people who took care of us, learning imperfectly a new language, and discovering that to learn a new language helps you to discover a new part of your brain that you might not have exercised without that opportunity. I also learned some things that have been useful in my life. My dad used to always take us when we were small, to the library every 2 weeks. And that particular library, all the children's books were from the 19th century and early 20th. And I read them all, books for girls. And through that, and I think probably my teachings at home, I had acquired a pretty, shall we say, late Victorian set of what was notions about what was right, what was wrong, what was correct, what was incorrect, how you're supposed to do things, the moral and right way to behave. And I was now living in a country where people didn't lie, but they did tell you what they thought you wanted to hear. And if you don't know the culture, you're going to find that people tell you that, oh, this will absolutely be ready on Friday without fail. And then it isn't, and you think people are lying to you. Well, no, it's another way of thinking, another way of acting in the world, another way of doing things with nothing. The other expression that I learned was dar un jeito, and that meant it's not yes, it's not no, it's not right, it's not wrong, it's find a way. So we can't do it this way, dar un jeito, find another way, fix it, do it. And that's been, I don't know why I never learned that before, but it's been a very useful concept for me to know, to employ. And in the event, after 5.5 years, we came back to Rochester. Kids all went to school. We found out that re-entry shock is a real thing. It was kind of hard that first year. You tend to idolize home, but they haven't been keeping your seat warm for you, and you need to re-enter their world, and there's no particular interest in their entering yours. The kids started school. They also faced challenges. They didn't know the right slang, the right clothes, the right whatever. I recall our elder daughter coming home. She was 14, and she came home one day and she said, oh, Mother, in effect, we had ruined life. She said, I'm small, I'm blonde, and I don't know who Marsha is. And everybody thinks I'm an airhead. I think she knows who Marsha is now, but she is still small and blonde, not an airhead. I had never imagined that we returned to church. I forgot it. Stephen went to the Winton Road Nursery School, and I became involved in that. And our children, while we were in Brazil, were going to Catholic school. That was a challenge for me, but it was a pretty happy experience for them. But I had hoped that they could learn more about Unitarianism. So I asked everybody to give me a year, and would they come back to church? And so we enrolled, the younger kids were enrolled in Sunday school, but we were told that our teenager would not enter the teen group, that was such a close group of kids that it was impossible to have somebody new join the group. That seemed a little unbelievable, but there was no way to dar un jeito about that. And so basically that was the end of our kids' religious education. One of them did go to a Quaker school, but nobody else got much of anything. I had wanted to work again. Steve was only 4 at this point, but I was wondering what I would do. It never occurred to me that I could teach English language in the United States, but it turned out the large population from Southeast Asia had led to the development of programs for refugees here in Rochester, and also that RIT was starting a program for similar to what I had been doing. And I was offered a job at both places. And though I wanted very much to take the job working with refugees, but the hours were better at RIT for the family. So I started at RIT, I think probably 1981 approximately. And just very part-time, very small program. They were just getting started. Then one day Howard came home and said, hey, you want to go back to Japan? So we packed up the kids and rented out our house and went to Japan, this time not to a little fishing village, but to Tokyo. The Japan of my memory was gray and brown and still recovering from World War II. Now Tokyo was this vibrant, bright, noisy, exciting kind of city. There's more neon in Tokyo, I think, than in 3 Las Vegases. A very vibrant place. Once again, trying to learn to drive on the left, but at least this time we had a Japanese car instead of the American car I had in the 60s. Settled the kids in school. Jessica was in college in the US, but Stephen got to go his turn at Catholic school. And we were there for 2 years. I got a job at Temple University, Japan. It's kind of a similar program to the one I left at RIT. I could walk to work, it was very nice. Again, part-time. I think that's all I want to say about that. But we then returned to the United States after 2 years. I went back to RIT, everybody went back to work, back to school. Stayed at RIT 30 years, I guess, more or less. Retired in 2011. And it was, I never quite imagined having pretty much the same title, same responsibilities. They changed over the years for that long a period, although that's kind of was then the kind of Rochester way. But what made it different and exciting was that my students always changed. And as every teacher knows, you learn from your students. But in this case, my students came from all over the world. English language teaching at that time followed oil money. So if parents had enough money to send their kids to the United States, it was probably from a country such as Venezuela, or Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, other countries where there was a flush, they were flush with money. So all these students gave me insights into their worlds, into their cultures, and it was a lot of walking into walls, trying to understand sometimes. But I used to say my children did not appreciate it, but it was one of the best things, like raising a kid. Watch them grow, you watch them change, and you watch them fade away. And that's what I got to do. But I also got to see history, live action history through their eyes. When Chile had its first democratic election, I had students from Chile who were so excited about that, explaining about that. When the tsunami hit Indonesia and Thailand, again, I knew people who were affected by that or had connections to that. When the nuclear reactor blew up in Japan, when the Arab Spring, we were so excited about the Arab Spring with such hopes, shall I say, such a naive American hopes for freedom and democracy in that part of the Middle East. Older Saudi students said, no, it will never happen. And they explained to me why, and we watched things come undone. When Libya exploded into civil war, I had a large group of students who couldn't reach their families, who couldn't go home because if they went home, they couldn't get back. And it was a very painful time for watching what they were going through. But all of it was wonderful to learn, wonderful to experience with these young people. And then finally, I passed my sell-by date, but I finally did retire in 2011, and I came back to First Unitarian, and there we are. Thank you.